China doesn't have allies. It has trading customers, and it has countries that it treats as vassal states and countries that it uses. And I would say countries that it uses are, I would put Russia into that basket. And the war in Ukraine has given China a complication because they publicly featured this new relationship with Russia.
Welcome to the latest episode in our Expert Series program. I'm your host, Josh Malm, Digital Content Manager for the CDA Institute. The federal government has announced it will ban Chinese telecom giant Huawei from accessing Canada's 5G network over concerns for national security. We sat down with Senior Fellow at the Institute for Science, Society and Policy at U Ottawa, Margaret McCuaig-Johnston, to discuss the implications of this decision for Canadian security, our partnerships such as the Five Eyes, and our relationship with the United States and other allies. Johnston provides insight into why the decision was pushed until recently, provides further update on the state of China-Canada relations, and she discusses the impact of the war in Ukraine for China's ambitions in the Indo-Pacific. Margaret, thanks for joining us once again for another Expert Series. It's always great to talk to you. Just as kind of a way to frame the discussion, I'm wondering if you can let me know what kind of calculations you think went into the Trudeau government's delay of the Huawei decision. Maybe you could discuss some of the benefits and costs of delaying the decision.
We don't know what's going on within government, so there's no definitive answer unless you ask a minister who's going to be candid with you. But I believe that they were delaying until the Michaels came home. There were numerous people commenting on China who were encouraging the government to follow on and actually announce the Huawei decision, even though the Michaels were still over there, and indeed to take some other actions to stand up to the to China for what they had done to our citizens. But the government chose not to do that. Within a couple of days of the Michaels coming home, the Prime Minister announced that the Huawei decision would be made in a couple of weeks or within a few weeks. And that didn't happen. It was actually 8 months before the decision was announced. So what was the delay there? One would have to speculate. Perhaps it was pressure from China. Perhaps they were trying to assess the way in which the ban would be laid out. It seems they've chosen legislation. And so there may have been considerations like that, but certainly we know that our Five Eyes allies were encouraging us to do this a lot sooner. And so it was disappointing. And there have been other decisions of the government related to China that have been delayed. For example, the Indo-Pacific strategy, which was begun in November 2019, still isn't out. The China framework, which was like a new China policy or strategy, was announced in December 2019 and then unannounced in December 2020. It was said that we weren't going to have one after all. Although I've noticed that the new US ambassador has been calling for Canada to announce a China framework. So there may be more included in the Indo-Pacific strategy when it is ultimately announced, and I hope that soon. In terms of what the benefits and costs of delaying are, I would say that credibility with our allies is one thing, but which is important. But more critically, we've been concerned about being exposed to Huawei 5G equipment. And TELUS announced in February 2020 that it was going to start installing Huawei equipment. Initially, they were installing Huawei software on top of 5G software on top of 4G hardware, but they were collecting and buying up the hardware as well, 5G hardware, and then they started installing that. Ultimately, they are also going with 3 other companies but they have a large amount of Huawei equipment already in place. And they have had for up to 2 years. And now we've got more than 2 years before they have to take it out. So that's a 4-year exposure to the very national security risk that we've been concerned about all along. So that, it seems to me, is the most significant problem associated with the delay.
What are the implications of the ban for national security and diplomacy? How has China responded, and can we expect any repercussions or backlash? And does this decision pose further risk to Canadian businesses or individuals in China?
Well, there shouldn't be any retaliation. This is a national decision that Canada has made, and it shouldn't be affected by, it shouldn't result in any kind of retaliation. Normal countries don't do that. But we know that China threatened retaliation. The Chinese ambassador threatened retaliation if we made this decision. In the case of other countries, they've been explicit as to what was at risk. So for Germany, they threatened Germany's auto industry in China if they didn't allow Huawei into their system. So Germany has got a policy where it's allowing Huawei into part of their system in order to stave off this, the loss of their auto industry in China, which is huge. In the case of Denmark, it was a free trade agreement. In the case of France, it was other specific industry sectors. In the case of the UK, they threatened to down tools on a nuclear facility they were building. Why the UK has China building a nuclear facility, I don't know. So they have been specific with other countries. In the case of Canada, they didn't specifically threaten any one thing. At the same time, we've seen what happened with Australia that simply called for an investigation into the origin of COVID. And they've had multiple industry sectors hard hit by trade retaliation, which is still continuing 3 years later. And they detained 2 Australian citizens. I don't think it's a risk for visitors going to China, Canadian visitors. Mind you, it's a pain to get in there now because of the quarantine and the shutdowns, lockdowns of whole massive cities. But should one decide to visit, I don't think that those individuals would be at risk. What China does do, though, is it detains citizens of the particular country who live in China and have lived there for some time and have interesting networks, especially networks into North Korea or networks with specific businesses in China, or networks with human rights or environmental activists. And so a detention in that case, and this has happened to Canada with both the Garretts, Kevin and Julia Garrett, as well as the Michaels, it sets up months and months of harsh interrogations in a tiger chair. That's a chair where your wrists and your ankles are clamped in vices, and it's usually a metal chair, although some of the older ones are wood, and it's very, very painful to sit there for 6 or 8 hours straight, and so they're trying to get information on that person may have. So it's a two-sided thing, these detentions. It's retaliation against the country with an innocent citizen, and China knows that Canada and other countries value their citizens and don't want them to come to harm, and it can get them concrete information by way of interrogation. So you know, if I were a Canadian citizen living in China, I'd be concerned.
What has been the impact of the war in Ukraine for China-Russia relations, and where does Russia fit into China's geopolitical agenda?
Some people were interpreting the major statement that was made just before the Olympics, talking about a new China-Russia accord and friendship and strategic relationship as allies. China doesn't have allies. It has trading customers, and it has countries that it treats as vassal states and countries that it uses. And I would say countries that it uses are, I would put Russia into that basket. And the war in Ukraine has given China a complication because they publicly featured this new relationship with Russia. They abstained in the UN vote about the war, and their disinformation campaign has supported Russia. However, I don't think they were seeing a rout of Russia as we've been seeing in Ukraine as in the cards. I think they thought they were attaching themselves to what would be a success, and it's not. And so, and furthermore, I see because of the war that other things that China's been doing with Russia, which is enhancing their relationship in the Arctic in order to use Russia in that context, and that's a very important issue for China right now, the Arctic. That's been further complicated by the war. So they set up a joint R&D lab. They've had joint military exercises in the Arctic. And they were hoping, I believe, to use Russia's chairmanship of the Arctic Council as a way of getting onto the council themselves, that Russia would facilitate China's membership on the council. But because of the war in Ukraine, the council's not meeting. All the other members said they're not going to meet, and indeed, they've said that they're going to meet separately to have a discussion around what to do about this, but they're not meeting as an Arctic Council. So China has lost that. And I guess the other thing is that it's proving to be really interesting in the context of what might happen with Taiwan, because there are parallels there. Russia has attacked a neighbor that says it's and is an independent country. China has openly talked about attacking and taking over a neighbor, which is a democratically elected government, and so there are parallels there. So China's watching very carefully what NATO is doing in support of Ukraine, and drawing some lessons for what it might do in support of Taiwan. And Biden has further advanced that by indicating publicly twice that the U.S. would come to the military support of Taiwan, the implication being involving troops. And so that, I think, is something that China will now have to think carefully about. In both cases, the White House has then tried to interpret or reinterpret what he said, but without contradicting him. And therefore, when you talk about ambiguity, strategic ambiguity, it's still a very ambiguous situation, because it could be a full sweep of simply providing equipment, as we're doing in Ukraine, through to a full defensive support. Now, we also know that in the tabletop military exercises where this has been mapped out, and I participated in one in Washington, the U.S. doesn't win. And I compare it as a home game and away game. It's a home game for China and an away game for the U.S., which is a big complication.